Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We are jumping straight into a profoundly heavy, centuries-old topic today, the classic problem of evil. Specifically, we're looking at how theologians actually try to reconcile the massive reality of human suffering with the existence of a perfectly moral, all-powerful God. Now, we all know pain carries, well, an enormous amount of emotional weight, but to really understand the source material we're unpacking today, I want to ask you to temporarily put on the hat of a completely detached, logical advisor. We're going to impartially map out the logic, the definitions, and the philosophical steps used to tackle one of the oldest questions in human history.
Okay, right out of the gate, let's look at the core issue. It's often called the Epicurean paradox, and the challenge cited by the source is simple but devastating. If God is all-loving but will not stop evil, is he actually all good? The source highlights this specific question because, honestly, it's a huge stumbling block for so many people. It really forms the bedrock of traditional atheist arguments, essentially putting divine love and divine power on trial against the backdrop of human tragedy.
So to keep us totally focused, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the problem of evil itself, define objective good and evil, explore the hidden benefits of pain, look at suffering as a catalyst, and finally break down choices and human suffering.
All right, Section 1, the problem of evil, specifically focusing on the atheist argument.
The source points out that these skeptical arguments specifically target traditional Christian concepts. They go after God's omnipotence, meaning his all-encompassing power, and his omnibenevolence, which is his all-encompassing love. The logic here is incredibly straightforward, right? A truly good God just wouldn't allow this much evil to happen, and a truly powerful God would simply hit the stop button on all the suffering. Therefore, the argument concludes, a God who possesses both of those ultimate traits simply cannot exist.
Moving right along to Section 2, objective good and evil, and the idea of moral contrast.
Now, what's really fascinating here is that the source doesn't start its counter-argument by looking directly at suffering itself. Instead, it looks at how we even define good and evil in the first place. To make this point, they rely heavily on this really famous quote from former atheist C.S. Lewis. "A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line." The source uses this idea to explore something pretty profound. Just recognizing something as fundamentally unjust requires that you already have a pre-existing standard of justice in your mind.
Think about it like a literal drawing. This brilliantly illustrates what the source calls the contrast principle. You literally cannot objectively critique a line as crooked or an action as unjust or evil without comparing it to a straight line, a universal objective standard of good. So, the source argues that by merely calling something evil, a skeptic is inadvertently admitting that an ultimate, objective standard of good must exist to measure it against, and theologians argue that this standard points directly back to a moral lawgiver, to God.
Let's jump to Section 3, the hidden benefits of pain, acting as a physical warning system.
Okay, the source asks us to step back and objectively evaluate something. Is pain always completely contrary to the idea of a good God, or can it actually serve a beneficial purpose? Think about how we diagnose an illness. Physical pain is often a totally necessary marker. I mean, without the initial pain of a symptom, a sudden fever, a terrible cough, a really sharp ache, you wouldn't even know there was a deeper problem. That immediate pain literally forces you to go to a doctor, investigate the source, and get treated. In this context, the source argues pain isn't objectively evil at all. It's a vital, life-saving alarm system. Building on that exact idea, we actually routinely accept temporary pain because the long-term benefit totally outweighs the discomfort. We do this math all the time, whether it's enduring the sharp, and let's be honest, entirely unpleasant poke of a needle to get a vaccine or taking on a massive emotional burden to help a friend through a crisis. We constantly calculate that some pain is absolutely necessary for a much greater good. Which brings us to Section 4. Suffering as a catalyst for emotional and mental growth. So, moving from physical pain to emotional pain, the immediate counterargument is what theologians call gratuitous suffering. Basically, pain that seems completely, utterly pointless. However, the source adds a major caveat here. It cautions that our perspective as humans is highly restricted to the immediate moment. Think of it like a toddler. To a child, a parent's strict rule just seems like pointless misery, right? But from the parent's wider view, that rule is actually protection. The argument here suggests that our human limitations might completely prevent us from seeing the ultimate long-term purpose of certain heavy trials.
The source provides some really concrete examples of how suffering actually functions as a catalyst for growth.
Let's say you make an incredibly unwise personal choice and you experience guilt or sadness. Well, that mental anguish isn't actually useless. By learning from the really uncomfortable consequences of poor decisions, that suffering actively works to correct your future trajectory. It teaches you to avoid touching that metaphorical hot stove ever again. Furthermore, taking on the emotional burden of a struggling spouse or friend definitely involves suffering, but it actively builds deep empathy and strengthens those relationships.
Let's look at Section 5, Choices and Human Suffering, and the Mechanics of Free Will. So, what are the actual specific mechanics of why humans suffer? Well, the source deeply anchors this in the concept of free will, breaking it down into a few main areas. First, you have personal choices. Choosing to smoke or ignore wise advice brings direct consequences to your own life. Second, the choices of others. Someone might make a deeply immoral decision, like drunk driving, which inflicts terrible suffering on completely innocent people. Third, past generations. The source notes how historical oversights, like the widespread use of asbestos or untested pesticides, cause sweeping health crises decades later. And finally, natural laws. The uncompromising realities of gravity, electricity, and extreme weather cause suffering when humans interact with them incorrectly or just get caught in natural disasters. To support the point specifically on personal choices and moral responsibility, the source cites the Bible directly, 1 Peter 4:15. The text argues that humans are fundamentally granted free moral agency. Because we have this ultimate freedom to choose, we are inherently responsible for the outcomes. The guidance here is essentially a direct instruction. Actively choose not to inflict suffering on yourself or others through destructive or immoral behavior.
But wait, what about natural disasters? Why wouldn't God just stop an earthquake or dynamically catch someone who falls off a roof? The source addresses this by arguing that if God constantly intervened to just suspend physical laws, like literally turning off gravity for a second to prevent a fall, the universe would become completely chaotic. The resulting lack of consistency would actually argue against a designed, ordered universe. We fundamentally rely on the absolute consistency of natural laws to survive and build our world, even if those exact same laws can occasionally cause us physical harm.
Okay, let's quickly recap the synthesis of the arguments we've mapped out today. The source asserts that the presence of evil doesn't actually disprove God, but rather proves the existence of an objective moral standard. It argues that genuine free will absolutely necessitates the possibility of negative consequences. It claims that much of our suffering actually provides long-term beneficial correction. And finally, from a theological perspective, it notes that complete relief from suffering is ultimately promised, but strictly on God's timeline, not ours.
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to really chew on based on today's explainer. If all suffering were instantly removed to completely eliminate evil, would we also inherently lose our freedom of choice? Can genuine human freedom, with all its beautiful potential, even exist in a world totally insulated from pain and consequence? It is a fascinating, massive dilemma to consider. Thank you so much for joining me as we mapped out this complex topic. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and I will catch you on the next explainer.